The gospel lesson for this week is taken from the 10th chapter of Matthew, the 24th through the 39th verses. Listen now for the word of God as I shall be reading it from the New Revised Standard Version. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave like the master. If they have been called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, and even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid, you are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. This is indeed the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Those of you who work with technology know that it is a wonderful thing, and it can be a great blessing when it works. When it doesn't work, it can be something less than a blessing. And I experienced that last night when I was trying to get my printer to print out my sermon. And it kept telling me that the printer was out of paper, but it was full of paper. I haven't figured that one out yet. And I guess I'll have to take it to a technician to figure it out for me. I'm not sure. But anyway, I am going to be looking at my sermon. If you see me glancing down at my cell phone, I'm not reading my email or something like that. I am trying to read my sermon. And I try not to read all of it. I'll try to look up some and try to preach rather than just read. Okay, so let me go and get this up here, and we will.
The Duchess of Edinburgh graced Royal Ascot today.
No, absolutely not. Nope, sorry. All right. In her recent book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Doris Kearns Goodwin looks at portions of the lives of 4 of our most admired presidents. She looks at portions of their lives and how those lives were translated later into the leadership styles that they used, and then how those leadership styles expressed themselves during times of crisis in our nation's history. One of those 4 presidents that she looks at in the book is Franklin Roosevelt. And Goodwin chooses to focus on one of the most difficult times perhaps the most difficult time in FDR's life. That is the time when he contracted polio, and how it would shape his life, but also how his leadership was shaped during the course of that illness, and how he used it during the darkest days of how he used his leadership style during some of the darkest days of our nation's history, the Great Depression. Like his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, who was also one of the other presidents in the book, Miss Goodwin writes about, Miss Goodwin writes about, Franklin Roosevelt's early years were ones largely spent in privilege and wealth along the Hudson River in upstate New York. While his father became ill and subsequently died when he was a youth, his strong-willed mother supported him, and young Franklin continued to lead an active life, marrying his cousin Eleanor, and beginning the political life for which he would become so well known. First as state senator for the state of New York in the New York legislature, and then assistant secretary of the Navy. Not only was he active politically, but physically as well. He was active in all kinds of sports, such as golf, swimming, sledding, fishing, sailing. Indeed, he had been engaged in many of those pursuits, both at his home in Hyde Park and his family's summer home in Campobello, Maine. But while at the Campobello house during the summer of 1921, he awoke one morning feeling not quite his usual vigorous self. Thinking that a day of activity would help to dispel what he thought was just a temporary case of the blahs, he went with Eleanor and their children on a day of sailing. And as they were sailing, they came across a bonfire, a brush fire, which they all helped to put out. Then he took his boys running and swimming, including a dip in the icy cold Bay of Fundy off the coast of Maine, which is absolutely frigid, I understand, even in the summertime, which this was. Before the day was over, however, Franklin, by now completely spent, had decided to call it quits early and take himself to bed. Over the next 2 days, it became apparent that his condition was not due to fatigue or the case of the blahs, but polio. He became completely paralyzed, unable to do anything for himself without the help of Eleanor and his friend Lewis Howe, who was staying with him. Later, he would spend 6 weeks in a New York City hospital. At the beginning of his illness, it looked like not only his political life, but also his personal active life was thought to be over. But Roosevelt would not give in. Roosevelt continued to try to regain strength, first in his upper body, till his upper body became so well developed he looked like a bodybuilder from the waist up. He exercised the upper portion of his body and even redesigned his wheelchair so he could get in and out of it without having to use arms. And so he could push himself in and out. He practiced crawling on the floor and getting up from the floor to his wheelchair or to the couch, and then decided to see if he could swim, and he could. He still could, and did. Even though Franklin could not go to the political meetings on his own, Eleanor and Lewis went for him and met with those who could help him, and they described his gifts and his talents and what he could offer the state of New York and the Democratic Party, so that his political career would continue, because they knew that if he did not continue in his political career, he would literally die, because he was so set on doing that. So when he had the chance, after a while, to address his party's national political convention and nominate that year's presidential candidate, Al Smith, Franklin, after weeks and weeks of practicing how to get to the pulpit or to get from his wheelchair to the podium without falling by use of his son's shoulders, was able to walk to the podium without falling, winning the cheers of the large crowd that was present in the hall that night. It would still be another 4 years before Franklin could run for office of the governor of New York. But in the meantime, Franklin took on the responsibility of developing the Warm Springs Rehabilitation Hospital in Warm Springs, Georgia, for polio patients. During that time, he got to know and empathize with his fellow polio patients, which in turn led to a compassion and empathy with which he had never had before, which he didn't grow up with. It was that spirit of empathy that would serve Franklin Roosevelt so well when he finally campaigned for and won the office of the President of the United States in 1932. Not only would his quality of empathy help him win the trust of the American people, but also his willingness to try new solutions to common problems in the midst of a time when many believed that the nation's economic problems were unfixable. And this was the beginning of the end, not only of the United States, but probably the world itself. It is hard for those of us who didn't grow up in the Great Depression to understand the magnitude of the fear that was present at that time. Not only were all of the nation's banks closed, but the New York Stock Exchange as well, and all the rest of the stock exchanges in the country. Thousands were out of work, or like my own dad, had to take lower paying jobs just to get by. And many had to resort to soup kitchens and bread lines to be able to eat at all. In the Midwest, due to heavy drought conditions in places all the way from Oklahoma all the way north, the land became what was known as the Great Dust Bowl. And many lost their farms due to that and due to financial hardship, which in turn led to more economic shortages and food shortages. Downtown business districts of major cities like Chicago and New York, instead of being the bustling places they normally were deserted, and those who were out walking walked like they did not know where to go or what to do. The first thing the newly elected president had to do was to calm the fears and panic of the entire nation as well as the rest of the world. And it was just that he was willing to do. Many of the programs that President Roosevelt developed during this time are still with us. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Social Security, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Like the time of the Great Depression, the time of the Church of the Gospel of Matthew's day was also a time of widespread panic and fear. While the words in Matthew's Gospel were supposed to be spoken by Jesus during his earthly ministry, the Gospel of Matthew itself was not written until many years after Jesus' death and resurrection. The writer of the gospel was believed to have been a Jewish Christian living at that time who addressed his gospel to other Jewish Christians. By this time of the church's life, Jerusalem had already been destroyed by the Romans, leaving many Christians to have to flee to Antioch or Rome. But not only was there persecution at the hands of the Romans, but also the Christian church, which had been considered up until that point a part of Judaism, was now beginning to separate itself from Judaism and Judaism from it. And so many Jewish communities throughout, those of its members who had professed Christianity or caused them to be imprisoned. Using the words of Jesus to speak to the members of his Jewish Christian communities, Matthew told them not to be afraid of those who could imprison or kill them, but those who would cause them to be unfaithful to Christianity or to fall away or be discouraged about their faith. Matthew also told his Christian community to remember that just as they were imprisoned persecuted, killed, so had their Lord been persecuted, imprisoned, and killed for being faithful to what God was wanting him to do. And in addition to this, Matthew told them through the words of Jesus that they were to give a good account of their faith, not just by their words, but also by their deeds. They were to show mercy to one another and to those who were in need in their communities. If they were divided by their beliefs from their families, they were to continue to pray for their families and show grace to them, even as Jesus had shown grace to them by his death on the cross. Yet even so, they were to be reminded that their ultimate loyalty was not to their family or to the faith they had left behind, but to Jesus Christ himself. Most of all, when times got scary, they were always to know that God had not abandoned them, but loved and cared for them in their community. In dark times and good times, God was always with them. In turn, they were to show the love and care that God had showed to them, especially those who were hungry or in need or sad or discouraged. It was this same kind of providential care of God that was also shown to the outsider Hagar and her son in our Old Testament reading for today that Emily read earlier. Just as the Christians in Matthew days had times when they got scared while experiencing persecution or conflict, and folks living during the Great Depression were terrified about what the future might hold for them, and even somewhat like Franklin Delano Roosevelt may have been frightened for the future when stricken down with polio. So sometimes churches get scared when facing a new ministry, especially a church like this one, whose last pastor didn't last quite as long as you would have hoped. And so now you have called a new pastor after an eventful couple of years of having to look again at yourselves and to maybe look at your strengths, but also to look at things that you could do better. But now comes the questions like, will this ministry last? Will our new pastor like us enough to stay a while? And will we like them? Will our church grow under their leadership? And will our new pastor be able to engage, will we and our new pastor be able to engage in meaningful new ministries in this neighborhood and even around the world? And even though the last couple of years, the life of this church, due to a pastorate ending early, have certainly not been like the experience of Franklin Delano Roosevelt having polio, it may have helped you learn about your things and the way you do ministry during this time so that you are prepared to deal with future crises that may come into the church. Just as the things that FDR learned about himself during his illness were able to help him minister to people during the Great Depression and then afterwards during the Second World War. In the same way, perhaps you as a congregation have been made more flexible and patient as you have been waiting just a little longer for the right pastor to come your way. I've enjoyed this opportunity to lead you in worship and communion, and I wish you all well as you prepare for this new time together in your life together. Prepare to welcome your new pastor. And so amen, and may the grace of God be with you. Thank you.